thanks for letting me share. So it's emotional to go back there.
Yeah.
But I can imagine that that is in itself.
Hey, hey.
I mean, that is the evidence in California.
It's a shape of a letter.
So where was it that happened to you?
Santa Barbara, fraternity where I was an advisor. It's also tied up with animal losses.
Oh,
Yeah, I was the
okay.
advisor.
The only time anyone
First day, and they asked me how much it would cost them for me to leave within 24 hours.
Wow.
Wow. The sea is quiet tonight.
The sea is quiet tonight, very good.
What's your birthday?
That's,
So what year was that?
Yeah, you weren't around.
What year was that?
1980. 1981, actually.
Yeah.
You were out that crazy.
Yeah.
I always say I have ice
Something.
cream, just for medicinal purposes to coat the stomach, you know?
That's a nice, yeah. Everyone in my family does
No, it's that fraternities have advisors.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Peg, should I put the ice cream away or should we wait?
Yeah.
Peg, should I put the ice cream away?
That would be nice of you, yes, thank you.
Yeah, keep it up to date.
So any other insights or reactions from the conversation that anybody wants to share
Yeah, that-
before we move on?
Actually, I was getting there about hesitation.
Like I said, there's a lot to this, so certainly hold on to it. Spend some time with it in reflection. I've given you some
Brett?
resources. And it just depends on how deep you want to go. The first set of resources is just very general. I mean, you can use these for any question that you have about faith. Obviously, the Catechism of the Catholic Church.
Is that the American Catechism?
That's the one that was done at Cardinal Law, coordinated.
Oh,
Yeah.
you recommend that one?
Yes. The reason I'm recommending this now, this is the caveat. When somebody says, what does the church believe on thus and such? All right, theology is not static. Theology, we're evolving our understanding of faith. So it's, when you say, what do Catholics believe, what does the church teach? There are theologies. Okay? People are trying to understand, if it's Catholic theology, it's always grounded and in harmony with Scripture. That's the basis, but there are many different reflections, expressions. So, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, I put it down here because right now it is the equivalent of the old Baltimore Catechism. This is what the U.S. bishops are using as sort of the common source of this is what the church believes. It's written paragraph style, but article by article, so you can say, well, I read this, and this is number 1564, that tells me about this particular point. But there are also footnotes that tell you for every paragraph of explanation what the sources are. So if you actually wanted to know what theology is being expressed in that explanation, the references would tell you. So it's the one used by the Catholic bishops. It will tend to be on the more conservative side. It's not reactionary, but it's on the more conservative side. To balance that out, I included a reference to a book that Richard McBrien edited, and the last time it was revised was 1994. It's called Catholicism. It's as thick as a Bible. It takes all the areas of Catholic belief, the creed, worship, sacraments, spirituality, and gives a summary, again, of what Catholics believe, practice. It's also footnoted, so you see what sources were used. This was written before the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So its purpose was to express for the general reader the beliefs of Catholicism from the perspective of the understandings that came out of Vatican II. So it tends to be on the more expansive side, let me say. It's completely in line with Catholic understanding and teaching. It's rooted and grounded in the Bible, but it tends to be on the more expansive side. So you get a little bit of balance looking at those two sources. There's a popular series right now on DVD and also streaming called Catholicism that was put together by Bishop Robert Barron. It is very popular right now because it's in a visual format. I have not seen it myself, but a group that I'm involved with, we are going to watch it over the next weeks. But what I'm told is that it is very well done. It follows the Catechism of the Catholic Church, so it tends to be on the more conservative side, but again, it's not reactionary or ideologue. And then to go back to what our current theology is based on is the understandings that came out of Vatican II. So there are two books, you can find these sources many different places, but there are two books put out, and Edward Hannenberg is involved. He is a lay theologian that writes a lot on the theology of lay ministry. He's very good, and he got together with a group that put together a book of the essential texts of Vatican II. You can get the documents, which are voluminous on every single subject, but I have not looked at this myself, but they collect what they consider the essential, the ones that would help you the most. So what I did on theology of discipleship, if I went back to Vatican II, I would refer you to Lumen Gentium, the light of the world. So then he has a concise guide to the documents, which is a commentary. And knowing the way he writes, I would assume, I haven't read it myself, but I would assume that it's very readable. Okay? So for discipleship, I have recommended this book, which is, again, a readable book with the theology of call as it relates to lay discipleship. It's very solid, but it's very readable. I included a book by Edward Hannenberg called Awakening Vocation, a Theology of Christian Call. He is very solid, but he is deeper. So if you want to go deeper into the theology of it, he's your man. And then we'll talk a little bit about suffering, and the other sources that I gave you will be on suffering. So I have another handout, again double-sided, that is a summary of what I'm going to offer you. Now once again, we could talk about this for years. It has been a subject of debate since the beginning of recorded history. So we are not going to solve the mystery of suffering in the next 45 minutes. What I am going to present to you is a theology of suffering that Peg and Jean and I would be familiar with. This is a theology of suffering that we, at least in this archdiocese, tend to use, that we operate out of. Again, we don't always discuss this overtly with people, but this is the theology of suffering that we operate out of. So Let me just give you a few points here about a theology of suffering. First of all, how do you define suffering? There are probably as many different definitions as there are people who have ever lived. Suffering is the most universal of experiences. Nobody gets out of this life without suffering at some point. But it is also the most individual of experiences. Everybody experiences suffering uniquely. And you know, the same event can happen and it will affect people differently. And I often use my grandmother as the example. She was an Italian drama rama, and she would say in her broken English, "Oh, Dio, Dio, nobody knows what I go through." And then we used to, that was our mantra for, even today, my siblings and I will say to each other, "Oh, nobody knows what I go through." But in her way, she was right. When we suffer, it is like it never happened before in the history of the world. It is very unique and personal to us. So, that said, I am going to give you a very simple definition of suffering that I took from my dear professor and wonderful man who has gone to his reward, Father Daniel Harrington, a Jesuit who taught scripture at BC for 40-some years. And his description of suffering is, it's to feel pain or distress, to sustain injury, disadvantage or loss, or to undergo a penalty. You could elaborate on that from now till kingdom come. What part of the human being, what parts are affected by suffering? Every part. The suffering its origination could be physical, mental, emotional, spiritual. But it often, no matter what the source of suffering, it affects every bit of us. The most important thing to remember about suffering is the mystery of it. It's easier to accept the fact of suffering, the fact that suffering exists and is universal, than to accept a meaning for suffering. We don't fully understand the whys. Sometimes we can look and there seems to be cause and effect. I smoke for 40 years and I get lung cancer. All right, there seems to be cause and effect. But then I look and I say, well, this person smoked 40 years and is healthy as an ox. Why did this one get cancer and this one didn't? Okay, we don't understand. Every explanation we try to offer falls short. So it's best that we come to terms with how mysterious suffering is. From a theological point of view, Scripture suggests two causes. It's caused by sin, because of human freedom to choose good and evil. Think Adam and Eve. Think the Babylonian captivity. The Jews are conquered and Jerusalem is destroyed and they're sent as slaves to Babylon. They're trying to make sense of it, and so the prophets and the priests say, we must have done something to offend God. Throughout Scripture, you will see references to illness being caused by sin. Why was this man born blind? Did he or his parents commit sin? We hear in the Gospels. Remember that human beings by nature are meaning makers. When things happen, we look for meaning. And we will invent meaning if we can't find it, even if it's not true. Okay. People looked around and they didn't know what caused illness. Must be sin. And they had a very, in the time that the scriptures were written, the understanding of cause and effect, everything was caused by God directly. If something bad happened, God caused it. If something good happened, God caused it. It's a very, understanding was very direct, everything was caused by God. The other expression of suffering in Scripture is that we live in an imperfect world. A created world, by definition, is not perfect. It has a beginning and an end. It has limitation and loss. So human existence, created existence, by definition, involves limitation and loss, therefore suffer. The book of Job is a very good example of this. Now, Job probably never lived. This is a story to illustrate a particular understanding of suffering. Right? And he is told by his friends that he must have done something wrong for all the suffering that he experienced to happen. And he rages and said, I did nothing to deserve this. And he says, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Well, as the sufferings pile up, he starts to get really mad at God. And he says, you know, curse the day I was born. I wish I had been aborted in my mother's womb, he says. And he puts God on trial. And convenes the heavenly court and puts God on trial. Ultimately, he gets no answer. God says to him, what do you know? Were you there when I created the world? Were you there when I separated the sea and the dry land, etc., etc.? He does not, Job does not take this as God is humiliating him and abandoning him because he doesn't believe. He has a powerful experience of God as God defends himself in that court. And he realizes, God is God and I'm the creature. I don't know why this happens, but I had such a powerful experience of God. At the end of the book, he says, now I know that my Redeemer lives. So the ultimate answer to the book of Job is, we don't know why there's suffering and evil. So the lesson to us is don't ever try to explain it. When I get up there, I'm going to ask, that's the first question I'm going to ask too. Before you tell me what I did right and wrong, tell me why. Okay? So, Scripture, sin, we sinned against God, therefore we suffer, or it's an imperfect world, and just by virtue of that we suffer. The Psalms are the other quintessential expression of suffering. You read through the Psalms, you will have every expression in human experience in the Psalms. Raging against God, complaining, whining, trusting. God is my strength, my rock, my shield, my fortress. Every expression. The Psalms are a wonderful place to go for you or for people who are suffering and for whom Scripture is a resource. Okay. Contemporary theology, and there are many contemporary expressions of a theology of suffering. I've brought one which is very readable but very solid. It's called Why God? A Glimpse into the Mystery of Suffering by Sister Rita MacDonald, who's a school sister of Notre Dame. It's very solid theologically, but it's a very readable, contemporary approach to suffering. So, we have heard, and there are many ways of expressing this in the Christian tradition over time. We have heard people try to explain suffering that it is God's will. God has a plan. God is testing me. Now, as chaplains, we don't go for that, but we never denigrate that. We may ask people to question that. But I had a woman that said to me, she said, I feel that God has a plan for me. And she had terminal cancer. And I said, does it help you to have that belief? She said, yes, it does. All right, I'm not going to argue with that. Okay? I don't think God's plan was for her was to have cancer, but okay, so many ways now trying to explain it, but these explanations always fall short. Okay? No matter what you say, there will be an exception to it. And I think today, because of what we have learned in science, medicine, all the ways we understand the world better, we have a much more complex and nuanced understanding of suffering. We know more what causes things. Whereas in the past, people didn't understand illness, they didn't understand chemistry, physics, and all the things that we know now, and so they would often turn to religion. It must be God that my child was struck dead by some unknown ailment. But now we understand a little better, and we understand that there is such a thing as random suffering. We saw it just these past few months with the windstorms we had. Why does somebody end up dying? Because their car happened to pass under a tree that fell on the car right at that moment. If they had been going 5 miles an hour, faster or slower, they wouldn't have died. Why do innocent children die? There is a randomness to suffering that drives us crazy, but that we understand is not necessarily caused by, we don't know what causes it. It's not the person's fault. It's not God's fault. We don't know why. We know it is, but we don't know why. So when we're working with people who are suffering, the best approach pastorally, and again I say, there are many approaches, but pastorally, is to listen. And if you respond, is to respond to them about their experience of suffering. Stay away from explanations. Try not to fall into that trap, because nothing we say will be adequate. I've had people say to me, I have to go to a wake. A friend of mine, her baby died of SIDS, the sudden infant death. What do I say? My advice is, I'm sorry. It must be so hard for you. There is nothing you can say that explains that or makes it better. Okay? So, this is a handout that I wanted to share with you, and it is focused on some principles, theology of suffering that we use as chaplains. So there are references to illness. Again, it's two-sided, but I just want to go over with you the side that has the 9 points. And this is reflective of a current Catholic Christian understanding of suffering. Suffering is not God's desire for us, but occurs in the process of life. It's not given to teach us something, but we can learn through it. Now, it says we do. We can learn from suffering. Suffering is not given to teach other people something, but they too may be able to learn from it. It's not given to punish us, but it is sometimes a consequence of poor judgment or sin. It doesn't occur because our faith is weak. Through it, our faith may be strengthened. It's not God's way to achieve the divine purposes. But through suffering, God's purposes are sometimes achieved. I call this as God always trying to bring good out of suffering.
Say it again.
God always trying to bring good out of
You
suffering.
believe that?
I do. Yeah. I do not believe that suffering is God's will for us. God's will for us is love, flourishing. Now, these last few have to do with the Christian Catholic understanding of suffering as redemptive. And this is a very, again, we could talk for weeks about this. But I think what is being said in these last three statements will ring true to your experience or to people that you know. Suffering is not always to be avoided at all costs, but sometimes is chosen. It's never chosen for itself, but for the sake of something or someone more. Think a parent pushing a child out of the way of a speeding car. Or somebody suffering because they get involved helping someone in a dangerous situation. There is also a line of theological reflection right now, rethinking the redemptive love of Jesus Christ. Did Jesus suffer and die on the cross because that was the Father's will? It doesn't sound like a father that any of us would like to have. Some of the theological thinking right now is saying Jesus was so focused on doing the Father's will, which was to announce to the world that the reign of God, the reign of love, was in breaking, that Jesus could not do other than be true to that mission. And so the consequence of the way that he lived caused his opponents to put him to death because he was a threat to the established order. Now, we know people like that who they have died, they have been killed because of their principles. They refuse to live any other way that would compromise the integrity of their principles. This is what we call redemptive suffering, when it's chosen or accepted. I mean, even Jesus in the garden said, don't let me have to do this, but if this is the only way, then I'll do it. It's chosen or accepted. It's never suffering for its own sake. Eight-point suffering can either destroy us or add meaning to life. There are always the two possibilities. We know of people who have been destroyed by suffering. All we can do is be with them, show them compassion. But if we believe in a loving God, God is always giving us the way to find life in the midst of suffering if we are open to it. This is why when I say when I'm with sick people, I ask for peace, strength, and comfort. Religious or not, I've never had anybody say, no, I don't need that. Always have the possibility of a peaceful heart, no matter how much they're suffering. And finally, that the will of God has more to do with how we respond to life than how life deals with us. So as people of faith, this is the only thing we have to offer to people that are suffering. We can't explain why. We can't always take it away. All we can offer them is Emmanuel, God with us. That God is with us through the suffering and that it makes a difference. They're not going to believe that just on our word. We communicate that because it's been our experience. And we share with them that experience in the hope that it might be their experience. It has made a difference in our lives, and we trust that it will make a difference in their lives. So, responding to suffering. Now, the guys that you work with have had all kinds of suffering in their lives. Some caused by poor judgment, some not of their doing. Still, from a pastoral, ministerial point of view, the best thing you can do is listen to their experience of suffering. So, in responding to suffering, it's good as ministers, as volunteers, to remember that we can never completely eliminate suffering in this life. That doesn't mean we don't try. We are asked by God to participate to the extent that we can. Okay? But knowing that we can never completely eliminate it, that gives us, as Jean said, freedom to try, to do our best, and if it doesn't help, to leave the rest to God. The only thing any of us has control over is our response to suffering. Only thing we have any control over. We can rage against it. We can passively endure it. We're the helpless victim. All of us have those feelings towards suffering, but if that's our only response, we will be miserable. What we have available to us and what we offer to others as people of faith is God with us. A loving God who is always trying to bring good out of suffering, who is always trying to lead us to fullness of life. Everything we could possibly want in life. We need to recognize that as creatures, as created beings, we do not see the big picture. We don't understand the full complexity of this created world, or the time or what it takes for God's reign to be complete. So as people of faith, it is essential for us to be able to trust that God's reign of love will ultimately prevail. If we can't do that, it's really hard, because then we burn out, we lose hope. It's not easy, this life of faith, but. So, as Christians, Jesus is our lived example of how to approach suffering. Because he was fully human, we're told he suffered, he experienced everything that we do except sin. So he struggled with suffering just as we do. And we see that especially in Mark's gospel. Mark is the one who really portrays strongly the humanity of Jesus. He weeps over Jerusalem. He gets frustrated because he cannot make them understand that God is visiting them with salvation. And he feels like a failure. He gets angry with the scribes and Pharisees because of their hardness of heart, he says, because they cannot see the message that he's bringing. He gets tired. He curses the fig tree because he's having a bad day and he's hungry. The fig tree isn't producing. But he also has an intense experience of Abba, of God the Father with him, loving and caring for him no matter what. And that overrides whatever experience of suffering he has. It allows him to cope with it, to deal with it, and to stay focused on his purpose in life. Just sometime reflect on that scene in the garden. I often use this with people who are sick, who are having a very hard time, and say, sit in the garden with Jesus, and you complain to him and to the Father about what's going on, and see what comes of that. And then you let Jesus walk that way of the cross with you, knowing that it doesn't end at the cross, it ends in resurrection. Now, we hear nothing about, we hear Jesus' agony, but we don't hear anything about how he resolved that, except the Gospel of Luke tells us that after this was over, angels came and ministered to him. We do know that that prayer experience ended in strengthening him by the effect that it had. After he let out all his pain and frustration and fear, he got up and he resolutely went to face the people who were going to arrest him and walk that way of the cross. And he continued to trust God even when he felt abandoned. He said, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" But then he said, "It is complete. Into your hands I commend my spirit." That didn't happen to him just on the cross. That was a lifetime of a loving relationship with Abba that he knew he could trust. As disciples, that's our challenge, is to grow in that loving relationship and that trust. Otherwise, we can't do it. We don't have the strength, the human strength, to be disciples in the face of all this misery without that loving connection with God. I often use a quote when I teach the visitors to the sick from the French poet Paul Claudel. He was active in the middle of the 20th century, very faith-filled man. And he wrote a poem that's translated. God did not come to suppress suffering. He did not even come to explain it. He came to fill it with his presence. Many things remain obscure, but there is one thing at least that we cannot say to God. You don't know what it is to suffer. The person of Jesus Christ, God knows what it is to suffer as a human being. So when we're with people who are suffering, the best thing we can do for them is to be a listening, comforting presence. If they're religious, faithful people, we can offer faith resources to them or help them draw on their own faith resources. If they're not, our listening, loving presence becomes the face of God to them. We are allowing God to love, and comfort, and strengthen that person through us. So, my remarks here are taken from these two books. The one from Dan Harrington is a scriptural approach. Why do we suffer? And it presents the way Scripture addresses the problem of suffering and evil. And from this one, Why God, a contemporary reflection of theological approach to suffering. So, questions, concerns?
Yeah,
And seeing what you're saying is kind of being our personal reaction to people's suffering. You know, inspired by our belief, in other words. But it seems to me that we also try in our circles to kind of raise the possibility of things going better. I mean, that's one of the things we do, I think, in the circle, is to not just listen to people suffering, but to draw on their experience of how, you know, from each other, basically, so what gave them strength, what kind of encouraged them to think that things aren't always going to be as bad as they currently are.
No, you're right about that. Remember in the first session I was talking about that mentality of scarcity and mentality of abundance, and that first we meet them in that place of suffering, of feeling like there's never enough for me. I'm suffering so much. First we listen to that. And when we feel that they feel that they've been heard, then we try to help them move towards, okay, what would help? What has helped you cope with that? What would help you cope with that? Any suggestions? The mistake I think we make sometimes as pastoral people is jumping into the what would help first, when the person may first need to be heard. They need to express their suffering and to be heard. So it's a both and, as opposed to either or.
I believe that even without words, just in the listening, we're helping a person to, we're giving them some relief. We're giving them a release and we're giving them relief. And sometimes I don't think we need to, I think God, we all know when somebody's asking a question because they want us to think differently. But I think what we do makes a difference, even if you don't acknowledge it. And one of the things I particularly like about what we've talked about, the dinner time conversation, that one-to-one where no one else is listening, or maybe people on the table are listening, but it's, just sort of, because a lot of guys do say, I mean, I've heard countless times men talk about losing their faith when something bad happens, or why would God do this to me, or why would God let this happen, the death of a child, or, whatever their suffering is. Things that probably many others in the group have felt.
Yeah, I mean, it may be that, if you're holding in grief, loss, any type of suffering that really weighs on you, and it can be almost a physical release to be able to express it, to talk about it, and to have somebody really listen to it. I'm sure you've had the experience of somebody, you just sit and listen while they pour out something and they say, oh, thank you, you've been such a big help, and you haven't really said a word. There's something very healing about just being able to say that. So what I'm suggesting is that when you're dealing with people who've been suffering, that should be the first step. And then certainly, when they're ready, help them to find ways of coping. Thank you. Now, I have a reflection question there. Given the time, I'd say let's not break into small groups now. You can certainly do this at some other time, but maybe just any thoughts anybody has. Does a theology of suffering like this, or you may have your own theology of suffering, but does it resonate, what I've said, does it resonate with your experience of suffering, either in your own life or in the lives of those you encounter? Does any of this resonate with your experience? And you don't have to reveal anything that's too personal, but anything that you feel comfortable sharing, where you're able to make a connection.
I think it makes you more real. Suffering. I think when you suffer and struggle, I mean, you're just, well, you don't want to go through the stuff that you've gone through. I think ultimately you can empathize to some degree with someone else. So while we don't wish ill will, or while we don't wish to suffer, it's like you said, it's part of the human experience. I think it's critical for us to be able to reflect on times that we have suffered and how that's felt and how we've been able to, how God's been with us through that. And ultimately, like, you get through it, and I think that's critical for helping us to listen well to the men, particularly when they're grappling with challenges.
I agree, that's a very good point. It's very easy to, because you want to avoid pain, not to reflect on your own suffering, to just kind of put it aside and just say, I'm just going to forget about that and move on. The way we come to healing is to move through the suffering rather than around it. If we try to avoid it, then usually it comes back to haunt us in most uncomfortable ways. So it's worth the discomfort to face your suffering. And if you have people to support you in that facing of suffering, if you have God to support you, it makes that process easier. But unfortunately, the only way to real healing is through suffering. I saw that in my own experience of working at a nursing home, and especially seeing people with dementia who had unresolved suffering and how it played out in their dementia, where they would relive the same. One woman who had lost a child who had never really grieved that loss, and I would come in and she'd be crying, so what's the matter? My daughter died. And I would relive that with her over and over again. To me, it was a lesson to myself, no matter how uncomfortable, process your stuff now, because it will come back to haunt you if you don't. And helping somebody, being willing to endure the discomfort of sitting with someone else as they do that is a huge gift to them.
I did a couple things from this. One, in that was kind of looking at it in this way, kind of objectifies it for me, almost like a darkness that's fallen upon you that you just kind of have to walk through till you come back into the light. And looking at it not as something to try to understand or think about, just live with. And in that way, I feel like it's easier. You know, we all have tough days or whatnot to come into this group, and you never know what's going on at home, but to put that, to have that understanding, enough that you could shelve it, so that you could really be there and open and present for listening to yourself. So in that way, I think it almost relieves, looking at it in that way, relieves the burden of yourself to do what we need to do. And then I think about it another way. I think about it, from the men we work with who have such positive and optimistic attitudes, despite all the suffering that I probably would have endured having been in their place. And I think about it, it kind of makes me feel like, wow, okay, maybe I need to respect them a bit more for being able to carry a bigger cross, so to say. I'm going to be able to live with a lot more suffering, a lot of other people to endure.
Yeah, I think the last three of the essence deal more with the type of discipleship that we're involved in, where it deals with suffering's not always to be avoided at all costs and sometimes chosen. A lot of these guys have chosen the path, and so they knew what they were doing. Suffering can either destroy or add meaning to life. I think the more positive ones that you're talking about, Julie, are the ones, they certainly keep that part of it. And then the last one is the will of God is more to how we respond to life than how life deals with us. And I think that's really very important to when you hear people with positive attitude or people with negative attitude. I mean, it's almost like it's a Dostoevsky. I mean, that's what these guys are living. And that's really how I've always defined their experiences through those last three. And the best of them get it. And you can really feel it from them. It's very strong. It's a very powerful, powerful human being.
It's also absolutely, and you know, God, only God knows why some people can move through suffering and move beyond it, and others are destroyed by it. But it's a huge gift of us as disciples to be with somebody in loving relationship who is destroyed by it. We don't know why they can't move through it.
Would you say it's a huge gift
To stay in loving relationship
people
with
who-
somebody
yeah.
who is destroyed by suffering. Yeah, we don't know why. Also, some of the things that you've all said, what I've heard is that you see that a person is not their suffering. You see the person beyond the suffering. The suffering does not define the person. And yet some people can sink into that I am my suffering. I can never get out of this. So I encourage you, if this is helpful, to do some more reflection on what I've given you, to get together, in groups or whatever, to consult some of these sources. It seems to me that the little taste of theological reflection you've gotten, you've all appreciated and enjoyed. So any way that you can continue that, I think would be wonderful. But it has been my pleasure to be a part of this. I just think you're doing a wonderful, wonderful ministry, and I'm so happy to contribute to it, the few sessions that we've had together.
Yeah, thank you. This is special.
My pleasure.
Thanks so much. It's been amazing. You're such a great model for teacher facilitator for us.
Thank you. I enjoy it tremendously, and I'm delighted to be of help. So you may see me in April. I'm going to see if I can come to Father
great.
Jim Martin.
Oh, good.
What's that?
Father James Martin is coming to talk in April.
Oh, look at that.
Oh, look at it.
It's spring.
Our first day of spring.
Perfect. The spring equinox.
Thank you, that's right. This is especially meaningful because my treat to myself for Lent was to go to a little morning of reflection that the Sisters of St. Joseph had a few weeks ago on hope. And at the end of it, they gave us each a sprig from a forsythia branch that just had a couple little buds, and it was pretty barren looking. So I brought it home and I stuck it in a vase, and my husband said, "What are you doing? You really think that's gonna?" Well, after a couple of days, some little yellow blossoms came out, and now some green leaves. I said, perfect. And So this will be my real, this will be Spring Has Sprung. Thank you.
It'll shock your husband when you bring that.
Replace that. He'll be like, wow, miracle.
Thank you very much.
Is that for Cynthia?
Yeah, that's for Cynthia. For Cynthia, yeah. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you,
The
Judy.
question is, where I'm going to lay this.
I want to commend Judy because I know she's been teaching pastoral care for a long time as it applies to hospital visits and home visits, but she really did take this content and adapt it for your program in a very special and deep way.
See, I learned something too, you know, it's always mutual. Thank you, and so for all the treats, he said the group that learns together meets together. Something very Eucharistic about that. That's right.
Peg always has a great sense of what the occasion calls for. It's very true. Like there's a birthday cake, a bouquet of beer. Oh my God, Peg, how do you do it?
Okay. I'm not going to be here next month. I'm going to be talking out, and I know it's on. Is when we shifted into,
P-Town, here we come.
That means you want to be with
the adults to sort of bring them on board with this.
And I never took one though.
Well, we might want to, as a group, kind of come up with what we collectively.
And then he kind of worried about.
So it's not urgent.
What's that guy?
Thank you. You're quiet. I care.
Every teacher I ever had said that kind of thing. So this is what I was writing here. So something
Appreciate it.
Yeah, that was it. So?
Sorry. It's my fault.
Yeah.
Because I am so suffering. Right now.
Who wants to take the cake home?
Hey, I'll do it, because I have a whole house full of people.
You have what, a house full of people? Excellent.